I think Madiba was a very extraordinary man. I think he was endowed with qualities that very few people are endowed with.
Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, into a royal family of the Thembu tribe in the South African village of Mvezo. His mother, Nosakini Fanny, was the third of his father's 4 wives. Then known by his birth name Rolilala, Mandela was adopted by Jogintaba Dalinyabo, a high-ranking Thembu regent who began grooming him for a role within the tribe's leadership after the death of his father.
Madiba during his childhood grew up in a rural area, but even then he exhibited certain qualities that forced his family to send him to some of the best schools in rural Transkei. And he then later on moved to Johannesburg. And when he was in Johannesburg, he was exposed to the brutalities of apartheid. And he didn't like what he saw. Actually, Madiba hated inequalities, he hated oppression, he hated discrimination. And in dealing with these issues that he hated, he threw his entire life behind the fight against injustices.
Nelson Mandela is an enigma. He is an embodiment of the real African personality. He really is somebody we should all look up to and would want to emulate if we want to be good leaders. His leadership style is one which looked at the past, the present, and created a platform for the future. That is to say, he looked at South Africa. Where are we coming from? Where are we now? And where do we have to go? And looking at that matrix, he was able to note that his governance system must not be a kind of vengeance politics we see in most Africa. So he needed to say that yes, we had apartheid. Yes, the African was discriminated against. Yes, several things went bad, Africans were killed. But can we sustain such a system in a reverse apartheid way? So he was not vengeful. After some close to 30 years in prison, he came and said, the way to go is a kind of peaceful coexistence in a South Africa which is prosperous.
When you mention the name Nelson Mandela, what comes to mind firstly is grace. A man full of love, a man full of forgiveness, and a man with the intense love for children. The other component of this would be the accumulation of all these qualities that I've mentioned that translates into his quest for the freedom of his people, and for that matter the African continent and humanity as a whole. So I see him as a humanist.
Nelson Mandela was a great African leader. Was great because of the time he came up. Right here at the Institute of African Studies, we are trying to study all past African presidents since independence. That's more than 50 years ago. There are about 295 of them. Some of them are still living. Nelson Mandela was great. We need to celebrate him. We need to acknowledge that. He was great because he was the first black African president of South Africa. He was great because he was able to reconcile the big divide in South Africa the racial problems in Africa. He was able to accomplish that without any bloodshed. So I think it was great.
The first in his family to receive a formal education, Mandela completed his primary studies at the local missionary school. There, a teacher dubbed his name as part of a common practice of giving African students English name.
He has had a big influence on Africa because everybody looks up to him as the headwaters of good governance in Africa. Besides, he's like an icon, to some a god, to some messiah sent from somewhere, to make sure Africa has a proper way of doing things. And so his influence is big. Even dictators in Africa refer to him as a good leader. And I think if this one had influence, then there is nothing anymore to say. On the youth, on even persons who talk about demeanor, psychological, psychiatric, people believe that it takes much of a human being to be able to forgive and forget. And Mandela represents that. So for me, he represents the real embodiment of the African personality, which Nkrumah talks so much about. That we have a lot in our culture that can make us build. And Mandela represented that. That the Africanness in us, the readiness to be communal, the readiness to forgive and forget, the readiness to set example. Nkrumah talked about all that in the African personality. And Mandela came to embody all that. And I think it's a big influence on all of us. That leadership is about humility. Leadership is about foresight. Leadership is about building together. Leadership is fulfilling, not promising.
Once upon a time, we had a generation of leaders who fought for the total liberation of the African continent. This first generation, Mandela was not part of it. But Mandela learned a lot from this generation and tried as much as possible to practicalize their wisdom, practicalize their policies towards a particular goal, again, the liberation of the African continent from colonialism, from slavery, and all forms of human indignities that the African people have suffered over a long period of time under colonialism and slavery. Let's also not forget that in the context in which Mandela grew was the apartheid system, a system that thought that one race was superior to the other. And this other race is the black race, and by extension, the colored community. He fought throughout his life to ensure that this domination and iniquities in societies, a country that is his. When I say his, I'm not referring, he here is not individualistic, but a country that belonged to him and his people, and the people here specifically are the South Africans, the indigenous people of South Africa, who later on became slaves on their own land.
I think when he said during his last statement, public statement in South Africa, that now it is in your hands, urging young people to take over the baton of leadership to ensure that not only South Africa but Africa as a continent, young people play a pivotal role in bringing about the much needed change. He realized that even though he had dedicated his entire life to the service of humanity, that we still have serious challenges of poverty, of unemployment, of homelessness, of hunger. Madiba hated this, so he said the young people must take over the baton of leadership so that they can confront these challenges, because I think he had also done a great deal in terms of just bringing to the attention of the world that we as the African people demand our rights, demand our dignity. And so I think more than many other leaders on the continent, he was able to restore the dignity of African people. And when he went to receive his Nobel Peace Prize, it was clear that this African man was going to be different. When he gave his famous lecture at a specially convened commencement ceremony at Harvard University, the only other two people who had been conferred degrees at a specially convened commencement ceremony at Harvard was Winston Churchill and George Washington. And when he spoke there, and he said, an African today stands before you to be in the same league as Winston Churchill and George Washington. This was a great day for Africa. And he was really unapologetic about the fact that he was an African. Repeatedly he said, I have given my life to the cause of the African people. So this is a man that has really done a lot, and we, especially you young people of Africa, you owe it to Madiba to restore this great continent to what it has to be.
Living wage. Africans want to perform work which they are capable of doing, and not work which the government declares them to be capable of. We want to be allowed to live where we obtain work, and not be endorsed out of an area because we were not born there. We want to be allowed and not to be obliged to live in rented houses which we can never call our own. We want to be part of the general population and not confined to living in our ghettos. African men want to have their wives and children to live with them where they work, and not to be forced into an unnatural existence in men's hostels. Our women want to be with their men folk and not to be left permanently widowed in the reserve. We want to be allowed out after 11 o'clock at night and not to be confined to our rooms like little children. We want to be allowed to travel in our own country and to seek work the Labor Bureau tells us too, we want a just share in the whole of South Africa. We want security and a stake in society. Above all, my Lord, we want equal political rights, because without them, our disabilities will be permanent. I know this sounds revolutionary to the white in this country, because the majority of voters will be Africans. This makes the white man fear democracy. But this fear cannot be allowed to stand in the way of the only solution which will guarantee racial harmony and freedom for all. It is not true that the enfranchisement of all will result in racial domination. Political division based on caste is entirely artificial, and when it disappears, so will the domination of one color group by another. The ANC has spent half a century fighting against racism. When it triumphs, as it certainly must, it will not take that voice.
The world is such that you don't have a flat platform. It's made up of a spiral kind of negatives and positives. So today a leader may emerge, tomorrow a bad leader emerges. Even in the Bible you have it. So I wouldn't think that he's the last. I can say that he's currently about the last that we have seen in the century. But who knows? Good leaders, trade transformational leaders are likely to emerge again. We all wait for that day. Either in our lifetime or beyond us, good leaders can emerge, depending on the situation, national and international. Because some international systems bred dictatorship in Africa. The Cold War international system, for example, where you have the patronage system, and therefore Russia would keep a dictator just for their own sake. America would keep Mobutu, and that kind of thing. So the breeding of African dictators has much to do with the international system also. And our own national kind of apathy, whatever, lethargy. But there may come a system which would demand of leaders, or which will create its own good leaders. But you can't step in if you are not good. If you can't step in if you are not that trade transformational leader, because the system does not accept you, rejects you. We can have that time. That time will come. The current system also accepts bad leaders in Africa. Because all you have to do is to give a semblance of democracy, liberalism. And the West will adore you. Oh, there is democracy in Ghana, Ivory Coast. Until there is chaos, then they say you're bad. But there may come an international system that has no room for mediocre leaders, for graft leaders, for people who are just predatory leaders, those who steal from their people and stay on in power. The time may come. So I wouldn't say Mandela is the last we will see in Africa, because what we have studied doesn't show that. The history does not give us the right to say this person is the last. I believe, for now, I do not think any African leader can match up to Mandela's stature and eminence. If you take the promise away, he represents the new African leadership, which we are not yet taking cognizance of or taking advantage of. Possibly, who knows? Anybody within our generation may bounce as a good leader. Who knows? Beyond us, somebody may bounce. I wouldn't say that he's the last.
He left a very big shoe to be filled. When Mandela was coming out of prison, he made a very important statement. I cannot quote him, but just to paraphrase, what he said to himself was that as I walk out of this prison, I will have to leave behind hatred, and bitterness. For if I don't leave them behind, I shall continue to be in prison. This was historical. A person who was imprisoned for life just because he was fighting for the liberation of his people. He was fighting for the freedom of his people on their own land, went through the Rivonia trial with 10 others. And the white apartheid regime put him through all sorts of maltreatment. But after almost 27 years, don't forget he was in for life. And even before this life sentence, he was already in for 5 years. Again, for organizing and mobilizing his people. To the extent that so-called civilized societies, civilized countries, like Britain, like the US, supported directly or indirectly this sort of regime. Let's also not forget it was at the same time that Martin Luther King and others were fighting for civil rights in America. So there was that form of correlation between the sufferings of the blacks of America and the sufferings of the blacks of South Africa, and for that matter, all colonized states globally. He made this statement: I would have to leave bitterness and hatred behind. Was this only a statement that he made and ended there, and that is where his legacy comes?
I've given the issue of African leadership very, very serious thought. In fact, I've written 2 books about African leadership. I cannot, right now I'm studying Kwame Nkrumah, and the book is going to be called Revisiting Kwame Nkrumah. Where do we go from here? I just came back from Addis Ababa, which has now become the capital of Africa, with AU there, OAU was there, and the Economic Commission for Africa. Everything is there in Addis Ababa. I really cannot tell you right now who is going to be the most transformational leader of Africa. I don't see it yet. Maybe Percy is not born yet. But I'm looking forward to a great transformational leader of Africa, because that's one of the biggest problems facing Africa: leadership and governance.
I think African leaders can learn a lot from the leadership style of Madiba. Madiba was a very principled man, and when you talk about discrimination, Madiba would never ever tolerate any discrimination. Madiba was a principled man because he stood for the truth. I think sometimes some leaders want an easy way out by agreeing with things that fundamentally they don't agree with and that are wrong. I think the legacy of Madiba will live on when people talk about his commitment to the ideals of the United Nations, of a peaceful continent, a prosperous continent. And so to achieve prosperity, you have to put certain measures in place. And Madiba was not ashamed to seek expertise from both South Africa and internationally when it comes to formulating policies that will advance the economy of our country. When you look at where our country was before the demise of apartheid and where it was when Madiba relinquished power, he had made great progress, great strides. So we need not reinvent the wheel. I think the collective wisdom of African leaders is what has to be tapped on. Ensure that inter-Africa trade becomes a reality, ensure that education becomes a priority, because education is the foundation of any society. Build your infrastructure in such a way that it encourages inter-Africa trade. That's what Madiba lived for. And we still have barriers between countries and within countries. I think it's important that those issues must be addressed and must be addressed as a matter of urgency. I think the other thing with Madiba, he wouldn't commit to something unless he knows that he's going to go out there and achieve it. He was a very passionate man, I think. Passionate about everything that he laid his hands on. And so what Africans can learn from that kind of leadership, it must be a people-centered leadership. It must be the kind of leadership that takes into consideration the aspirations, particularly of the poor. Because on our continent, the poor constitute the majority of the people of Africa. So I think one of the things that I am really inspired by was the fact that even in the townships in South Africa, when you talk to people there, they will tell you that Madiba used to walk those neighborhoods. Very, very unusual.
The time in history when Nkrumah came has its own specificities. Decolonization. So Nkrumah would have to have some different kind of approach to governance. Let me give you one example. Nkrumah came just like Mandela. Let me talk about the similarities first. Saw the past, saw the present, and said, what future do we need? Nkrumah saw the polarity, poor, rich. He saw the absence of everything. No industrialization, nothing, whatnot. And then Nkrumah, just like Mandela, was not vengeful. It was not a kind of sack the whites away unless he became prime minister for a while, as he was under tutelage, to be able to steer the affairs of Ghana. And you saw that state leadership of the governance system, of the economic governance system, was better than capitalist affairs and dog-eat-dog affairs and whatnot. And he steered Ghana towards that and wanted a one Africa. He was uncompromising on the African unity thing. Mandela did almost the same in minus, taking the leadership of Africa. That's a big difference. Mandela never came and said, I'm going to emancipate the whole of Africa. He was using South Africa rather as an example. Let me build my South Africa. We have several problems. The problem specifically being that historical accident called apartheid. Can we hurdle and make sure that there's no chaos in South Africa before we mount the Africa platform? That's number one. Number two, another big difference of Mandela and Nkrumah is not only time, but the demeanor. I think if we had apartheid, Nkrumah would have been more uncompromising on the whites than Mandela did. Mandela suffered more than Nkrumah did. Nkrumah went to prison for a few months. Mandela went 27 years. He was very healthy and never came back vengeful. But Nkrumah didn't have the temperament and the patience for imperialism. There's not a single book of Nkrumah I've read where the hatred towards imperialism and neocolonialism were not attacked. You know, it was clear. He hated the whites for doing X, Y, Z to us and continuing to do it. So I think if Nkrumah went under so much torture, mental torture especially, like Mandela did, he would have been very, very much uncompromising on the whites. The little he showed to augment or to prove what I'm saying is his positive action call. Few people understand positive action. He called on blacks to get up, fight the whites, not physically but boycott their goods. People went looting, especially the Lebanese shops and things like that. He's called for positive action now. These are militant calls. Mandela, after he had been incarcerated, never called for positive action, even though when he was incarcerated, his people were killed, Soweto, name them. So this is the big difference. But generally, they were enigmatic, charismatic leaders, both. Nkrumah was seriously charismatic, was the reference point by all Africans and African leadership. You go to Nigeria, Nigerians want to be Ghanaians. You go anywhere, Ghana. So Ghana got independence first, spearheaded everything, got a republic, and we were progressing faster than any other African country. And everybody wanted to see an Nkrumahist kind of governance throughout Africa. Mandela came and saw how he has to build South Africa, and he became the reference point also for what? Democracy, irrespective of what has gone in the past. So the two are seemingly at par when it comes to leadership, when it comes to charisma, when it comes to fulfillment. You know, for me, these two are unparalleled on the continent. Nkrumah came at his time, Mandela came at his time. We're yet to see a new crop that we will refer to and say, this is how to build Africa. We're yet to see that.
Leaders come out of a particular situation and challenges. So the Nkrumah challenge was different somehow from that of the Mandela challenge of his time. Just as we are told by the good book that prophets are sent to generations. Every generation has its own challenge. And out of these challenges, you have leaders who come out naturally and lead the people out of darkness. Fight for them, serve for them for prosperity. And that is where I will place the two of them. In terms of culture, Nkrumah did Mandela. Look at him, he dressed simply. In fact, we are told in writings, various writings, that Mandela, quote unquote, hated the tie. He cherished his culture. He cherished the African attire. And he found it difficult. He felt very uncomfortable with what? The tie. And I must tell you today, I have been to Johannesburg and I visited Soweto. When I went to his house, which is now a mini museum in Soweto, in his bedroom where his bed is, at the top of where his head is, the head side of the bed, are certain, cultural words that he's cherished. In the middle of it is the Ghanaian fugu. When I saw the Ghanaian fugu, I was amazed. So I asked my guide, why this and where? Then he said, Mandela always talks about it. And that it was given to him by Dr. Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, when he visited Ghana. And I was happy. So you see how he symbolized Africa and kept it intact. These are the leaders that we need in our communities and in our nation.
There are people who argue that he spent much of time dealing with South African problem and he lost sight of the quest for African unity, the Pan-African movement. He was really not quite part of that. He was not as effective as Nkrumah was or as Haile Selassie was, or even Nasser from Egypt. So in a sense, he was preoccupied with the crisis of South Africa, and so he never really paid much attention to the unity of Africa. I wish he did. Maybe it would have been a different story.
In 1939, Mandela entered the elite University of Fort Hare, the only Western-style higher learning institution for South African blacks at the time. The following year, he and several other students, including his friend and future business partner, Oliver Tambo, were sent home for participating in the boycott against university policy. A few weeks after Mandela returned home, Regent Jogin Taba announced that he had arranged a marriage for his adopted son. The regent wanted to make sure that Mandela's life was properly planned. Shocked by the news, feeling trapped and believing that he had no option than to follow this recent order, Mandela ran away from home. He settled in Johannesburg, where he worked a variety of jobs, including a security guard and a clerk. Mandela soon became actively involved in anti-apartheid movement, joining the African National Congress in 1942. Within the ANC, a small group of young Africans banded together, calling themselves the African National Congress Youth League. Their goal: to transform the ANC into a mass grassroots movement, deriving strength from millions of rural peasants and working people who had no voice under the current regime. Specifically, the group believed that the ANC's old tactics of polite petitioning were ineffective. In 1949, the ANC officially adopted the Youth League's method of boycott, strike, civil disobedience, and non-cooperation, with policy goals of full citizenship, redistribution of land, trade union rights, and free and compulsory education for all children. In 1956, Mandela and 150 other people were arrested and charged with treason for their political advocacy, but were subsequently acquitted. In 1961, Mandela orchestrated a 3-day national workers' strike. He was arrested for leading the strike the following year and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. In 1963,
volunteerism is good. That's a good way of training young people to become leaders. I think Nelson Mandela is a good role model for potential African leaders. It doesn't mean that he was perfect, but was a very, very effective role model leader. He was a man who spent most of his life in the prison and came out to become a president of such a great country and led it towards independence. So he deserves some credit. But what happened after Mandela is a different story. There is no Mandela in South Africa as we speak. His legacy is there. We have to examine the legacy. Could he have done it better? Maybe.
The youth in Africa must emulate something very important: perseverance. Persevere. Humility. You must be humble in whatever you're doing. And again, within our humility and our perseverance, we must have the will to succeed, an undying spirit, the will to succeed. It is doable, you tell yourself. It is achievable. And finally, the biggest legacy is left to the youth, and generally everybody, is the question of patience. The ability to forgive and forget and get on in life. And all that I've said, one philosophy I think Mandela leaves us with is when he says, where do we go from here? It's like, after all tribulations and whatnot, when things happen to you, ask yourself, where do we go from here? Because it's happened already. So you're only asking, where do we go from here?
Mandela was brought to trial again. This time, he and 10 other ANC leaders were sentenced to life imprisonment for political offences, including sabotage. Nelson Mandela was incarcerated on Robben Island for 18 out of the 27 years in prison. Despite his forced retreat from the spotlight, Mandela remained the symbolic leader of the apartheid movement. In 1980, Oliver Tambo introduced the Free Nelson Mandela campaign that made the jail leader a household name and fueled the growing international outcry against South Africa's racist regime. As pressure mounted, the government offered Mandela his freedom in exchange for various political compromises, conditions he rejected. On February 11, 1990, newly elected President F.W. de Klerk lifted the ban on the ANC and ordered the release of Mandela. Mandela proceeded to make his first speech after his release from prison.
He is a unique president or leader of his time. Other leaders have played their role. For instance, take the president of Tanzania, who gave all the support that the ANC needed to be able to fight apartheid. There is another country that gave them the opportunity to have a broadcasting station for them to be able to link up with the motherland, South Africa, from afar. And the apartheid system tried to find out where they were located, but it was quite difficult. They were out of South Africa. You can talk about the support in terms of military, in terms of services, because he has traveled across the African continent to places like Algeria, where he was trained, and some other countries. He, of course, was in Ghana at the time. These leaders played their role in context. They fought for the demolition of colonization, and that was perfected with the liberation of South Africa from the aprons of colonialism and the destruction of colonialism, for that matter, apartheid. So for his generation, he is unique. There is a sense where we can say that if we talk about African leaders who have actually performed, then Mandela is one of the gentlemen who stood out. Let not forget that in terms of the leadership, again, as I was pointing out, the challenges of today are beginning to take a different trend, and in 10 years we are likely to see some challenges that may not, because now we have dismantled colonialism across the African continent. We have political independence. Our struggle today is economic independence. Who is going to get us out of that? Leaders can come out to set examples, even though Mandela has showed the way. So I believe that all the efforts of Mandela in helping children to imbibe some of his values and qualities will not be in vain. Across the African continent, anywhere you go and you mention Mandela, everybody knows. And we all have our different, values that we cherish, which we think he has, perfected in a certain way. Tomorrow, some of these children who have learned from his values are likely to also come out as leaders in their unique sense.
Mandela has a great example of resilience. He was always very optimistic, even when he was in the prison. He reminds me of Martin Luther King, of the civil rights movement. They knew that one day the people will be free, and he worked towards that goal. Our current leaders, I don't know what goal they have. I've studied the AU, I don't know where they're going. Okay? That's the problem. Everybody is talking, but when you look at action, it is not there. So Mandela has a great quality of resilience, of patience, of forgiveness, of cooperation, of collaborating with people, of looking at people as human beings, He didn't hate his enemies. It reminds me of biblical stories. You don't have to hate your enemies. You love them and you pray for them that one day they will change. It's my hope that South Africa will be a sustainable state. He has left it in the hands of South Africans, black and white. What they're going to do with it is in their hands. It's no longer in the hands of Mandela. He has played his role and is gone. We have to cherish his legacy. And young people have something to emulate about Mandela's patience. Even though he got old, he was still a very, very strong leader. Now, his wife is trying to build a hospital for young people. That is going to be his legacy. For young people have no hospital, no mental health hospital. That's a part of the struggle to raise good families, young people who are energetic, who can live above poverty and ignorance and disease.
I think Madiba was very bitter against apartheid. That is the thing that made him the angriest, that the dignity of his people was being so violated. But I think also when he went to prison, he had the time to reflect on his many years of experience in leading in different capacities. And so I think he just told himself that vengeance is not an option, because he didn't want to see our country engaged in a bloodbath, African against African. So he thought there is a different path, and he followed that different path, and thus earned his stature as an international statesman, because his approach was able to bring South Africans together. Madiba was also able to bring the whole international community together to be against the policies of apartheid. It was in 2008-2009 when the World Parliament at the United Nations General Assembly decided to declare his birthday a Nelson Mandela International Day as a tribute to the many battles that he fought and won against injustice, against HIV and AIDS, against poverty, against racism. These are global issues. Of course, apartheid took them to another level, but Madiba was able to really open people's hearts globally, from Japan to the UK, to Accra, to Lagos, to Indonesia. Around the world, people got to know about Madiba and actually embraced the ideals for which he had gone to jail. And today, more than 100 countries will be celebrating Madiba Day, Nelson Mandela International Day. I think that is no small feat. I think Madiba's legacy will live on forever. But before we go outside our continent, I think it is the African people themselves who should be moved by a grave sense of justice to fight against the ills that we are currently experiencing on the continent, particularly what is happening to the girl child in places like Nigeria, for example, where 200 young girls have been detained only because they wanted to go to school. You know, I think Madiba would have been seriously saddened to see that we are not making enough progress, that these kinds of things, while he stood for equality and for everybody to have access to education, he was very passionate about education. For him to hear that the girls have been detained, abducted because they wanted education, I think would have been very saddened by this.
After attaining freedom, Nelson Mandela led the ANC in its negotiations with the governing National Party and various other South African political organizations for an end to apartheid and the establishment of a multiracial government. Though fraught with tension, the talks earned Mandela and de Klerk the Nobel Peace Prize in December 1993. On April 26, 1994, more than 22 million South Africans turned out to cast their ballot in the country's first multiracial parliamentary elections in history. An overwhelming majority chose the ANC to lead the country, and on May 10, 1994, Mandela was sworn in as the first black president of South Africa, with de Klerk serving as his deputy. So, who really was Mandela to you?
It's a great day. The whole of Africa must seriously embrace this. I was shocked in Ghana when we were celebrating in Commerce Centenary, and I thought my birthday celebrations were better. I'm sorry. Mandela's 90th birthday was not organized by South Africans. People from all over the world converged in London. Concert here, concert there. That is the man. And if we really want to eulogize these two people, or even Mandela, let's embrace him. Let us make the day a memorable day for the youth to learn about Mandela. Who was he? What did he stand for? What does he give us? So programs throughout Africa must necessarily uphold Mandela. Let us enjoy the day better than we enjoy Empire Day and what UN Day and whatnot. For us, Mandela Day should be celebrated, not just a holiday. We love giving holidays. I believe in a celebration that is monumental. You finish the celebration and it is in you throughout your life, throughout the year before another day comes. It's like, take your Independence Day. Who remembers after the day is gone? Because those things we do are not monumental. There are no edifices to show that, either in our minds or out of our minds, edifices, clear edifices to show that, hey, look, we have celebrated a day. I want this day to be celebrated by all Africa. Symposia, roundtable, books, letters, what things that will make the youth, oh, who is that man? Let me look for him. Let me look for what he stood for. And the essence of Mandela will be spread over the minds. I know him. I feel him because I read and I'm still reading. I have his films and his witty sayings. Look, not witty, sorry, his philosophical sayings. I have a catalog of them. Everything he says. When I'm teaching, I use some of them. About peace, about tolerance. One paper I gave in town with his picture there and the words, accompanying words. I still have them. So I feel him, I need him, I know him. What about my children, my children's children? That is the only tribute we can pay to Mandela. If we don't do this, the celebration is of no use. It can go to the history books that on the 18th of so and so, Mandela was remembered.
I think the UN has said if we could spend, forget the word is 56 minutes or so of our time in a day and think about some of the values that Mandela stood for and try to actualize them, then of course we'll be doing a great job. So for instance, the commitment of Mandela in change of communities is very, very important. So the youth of today, the leadership of today must create the enabling environment. Even if the enabling environment is not there, the youth of today must take it upon themselves to study their communities and see what they can do to transform their communities. It will even be good if we can start at the family level. You have a family of 2 brothers or 3 sisters or a mixture of brothers and sisters. You identify your challenge in the home. and then you are able to sit down and think through and come out with a solution, you'll be helping your family, helping your parents. And if we move from the family level to the community level, then of course we are developing. Then gradually, as a nation, if we have so many communities all engaged in development efforts, before we realize, it catches up with all of us, and real change will really happen. That was what Mandela was doing, and I think this is important for all of us.
Madiba Day reminds me and reminds you and all of us that it is important to serve. It is based on the principle of service to your fellow human beings. It says to us that we have a responsibility towards one another. That if you can spend 67 minutes of your time to serve those that are less privileged than yourself, that will lead to the creation of a better world. Madiba spent 67 years of his life servicing humanity. So he has asked us, and the General Assembly in the United Nations unanimously agreed with him that this day should be a day on which we reflect on what we are doing individually and collectively as countries, as societies, to help those that can take care of themselves. And he said, give service, read a book to a child, visit a hospital and help somebody in the hospital who doesn't have visitors.
Chama sa Yesu, Mfeli se vitwali mazwe.